Welcome to all of you. It's always wonderful coming to the Frontline Club because you look across the packed room and you see so many familiar faces. It's been intimidating too because you see a lot of people who know a lot more about the subject than I do, and so you anticipate their questions. I'm Lyse Doucet from the BBC, and I have been a friend and fellow traveller of Ahmed Rashid since early 1988 when I first went to Pakistan. And looking across the audience, I see probably many of you also date your time when you got to know Ahmed Rashid from that time. And in fact, it's really lovely to sit here with Ahmed. In fact, the last time we sat together, I think we launched your last book. Yeah. I'm not sure what it is, but believe me, I don't get any privileges. I still have the uncorrected proofs, which is, of course, the book he can't sell. And that's what I get as his long-standing friend. But when we have Ahmed Rashid here, I think many of us, our thoughts go back to what was really the founding of the idea for the Frontline Club, because those were the years when individuals like Vaughan Smith, who of course established this great gathering place for all of us, and Peter Juvenile and other very talented and brave video journalists, even before they were called video journalists, started collecting films from inside Afghanistan and from the areas along the Pakistan-Afghan border. And in a way, that's what Ahmed Rashid has been writing about now for more than a decade. That period, that historic period when the Cold War was coming to an end. There was the Mujahideen, the American-backed Mujahideen war, Pakistan-backed as well, against the Soviet-backed government in Afghanistan. And as we sit here tonight, all of you, and I see a lot of people in the audience who are thinking a lot about Afghanistan and Pakistan these days, and a lot of people are thinking about 2014, and so little time left before the US-led NATO pullout begins from Afghanistan. And Ahmed Rashid has been writing about not just Pakistan, his own country, but Afghanistan and the wider region with authority and with great affection for many years now. And so we're very pleased to be here to launch this book, Pakistan on the Brink, the future of Pakistan, Afghanistan, and the West. Ahmed Rashid, welcome.
Thank you.
It's great to have you here.
It's lovely to be here. It's lovely to have you introduce me. And the first words I said to her when I came onto stage was, I said, "Lyse, don't make me cry." Because there are so many friends of mine here who go back 20, 25, 30 years in this whole business of journalism that we've been in together. And it's lovely to see all of you.
Well, I'm going to start with, as usual, practice here in the Frontline Club, and I'll first have a conversation with Ahmed, which you're all invited to listen to. It'll be very correct. And then it has to be a conversation with all of you to hear, because a lot of you know Ahmed, and you certainly know the region, and so we'll open it up to questions as well. And Ahmed, since it's an adult audience, and it's sort of getting to the evening hour, we can start by beginning to use the F word, which is failing. Now, this has become a category that is used for countries around the world of failed states. And suddenly the F word is sometimes used with Pakistan. And it comes into your book, whether it's a failing or risks becoming a failed state. You do describe it as the most fragile place in the world. How do you come to that conclusion?
Well, you know, Pakistan is the most fragile state with nuclear weapons right now. It is beset with a crumbling economy, sectarianism, insurgencies in 2 of the country's 4 provinces, still arming and giving sanctuary to Islamic extremists of all kinds who are active in India, in Afghanistan, in Central Asia. And the essential, what I'm trying to write really is that, we have failed to reform and change. We have refused to grow up and stop acting like children. And the last, real point of change. I mean, a lot of authors have written books about Pakistan which go back to 47, the mistakes made then with Jinnah dying. And, you can go back to 71 and the loss of Bangladesh and the loss of East Pakistan and the creation of Bangladesh. I go back to really the end of the Cold War, 1992. And I say that the whole world around Pakistan changes. The clientism that Soviet Union and the US provided disappeared. You had to stand on your own feet, you had to do trade, you had to build good neighborly ties, you had to concentrate on building up your own economy, because the handouts from the superpowers were now gone. And Pakistan never did anything. Everything passed us by, globalization, high-tech, new industries, and we were still obsessed. We were fighting a war in Afghanistan, supporting the Taliban. We were fighting a war in Kashmir, supporting the Punjabi groups who were fighting at that time in Kashmir. So we were obsessed with things that had no relevance whatsoever. And then the final wake-up call to my mind was 9/11, where, you know, that was the end of using state sponsorship of terrorism and extremism as a means of foreign policy. Yet there was no let-up. We give the Taliban sanctuary. We helped the Taliban relaunch their offensive in Afghanistan. And even though there was a ceasefire in Kashmir, which fortunately has been holding, you know, since 2004, in Afghanistan the situation continues to go to bad to worse, partly because, not wholly, but partly because the Taliban do have safe sanctuary in Pakistan. And as we just saw with the Haqqani attack, that, you know, it seems that most of these people came across the border. These people
the attack in Kabul.
The attack in Kabul. And, yeah. So essentially, you know, what I'm saying is that we desperately, the military in particular, needs to reduce its stranglehold over foreign policy and help change the ship of state around. And essentially we have to slowly, but we have to decisively give up on this support for extremism. We have to facilitate a peace process in Afghanistan. None of these things we're doing right now. And if we fail to do this, and I've just come from Washington, and I mean, the feeling there is that, you know, everybody's totally fed up. Nobody wants to deal with Pakistan. And this is a very dangerous situation because Pakistan is not, you know, our economy, everything is dependent on international relations through Washington. You know, it is through Washington that we develop our international ties. If Washington decides that, you know, they've had enough, you know, Pakistan is more of a liability than anything else, and we'll humor Pakistan, but we certainly won't treat it as an adult, then I think, you know, we're in serious trouble with the rest of the world.
But don't you make the point in your book that it's not just, and you've written about this frequently, it's not just that Pakistan is double-dealing, cooperating, but then working with these extremist groups as proxies. It's also that the Americans are double-dealing. So, as you said, you think both of them have an underlying, they're locked in this underlying death wish, as you put it in your book.
Well, certainly. I mean, you know, I'm very critical of the Obama administration. The hopes that I had and many people had when they came in, frankly, have not been fulfilled. And the aims of the Obama administration in Afghanistan, for example, a regional settlement, etc., seem to be much further away than they were back when he was elected, you know, to office. Now, apart from that, obviously, there has been enormous duplicity on the side of the Americans in this way. I mean, if you just take the drone attacks, for example, the fact is that the Americans had drone bases in Pakistan that were being drones were being fired from Pakistan, hitting targets inside Pakistan. Now, you know, the Pakistanis agreed to that, which was, of course, their duplicity, but the Americans wanted to do this, which was dead. And neither, of course, informed the publics or the international community or anything else. So, again, the use of the CIA, the massive use of contractors, which of course led to the Raymond Davis affair in Lahore, the killing of 2 Pakistanis by the CIA contractor. All this has helped fuel anti-Americanism. Now, unfortunately, partly anti-Americanism has been fueled by the state, by the military and the intelligence agencies. But a lot of the anti-Americanism is a reaction to the overwhelming you know, policies of the United States, which do not, you know, did not seem to have a rationale at that point in time.
Well, you describe Pakistan not only as a fragile country, you say that it's not a normal country. And let me just read you this great quote. A lot of you are historians here in this room, and he uses it to illustrate this thesis. It actually comes from 1889 from Sir William Butler, F. Butler. The nation that will insist upon drawing a broad line of demarcation between the fighting man and the thinking man is liable to find its fighting done by fools and its thinking by cowards. Who's running Pakistan, the fighting men or the thinking men?
Neither, unfortunately. Neither. You know, what we're seeing in Pakistan in the last couple of months has been a total abdication of responsibility and ownership for governance and for policy. And where this could lead us to, I mean, I shudder to think. This dispute with the Americans that went on for 5 months, and is still continuing because the negotiations still have to take place about how to restore relations with Pakistan. Nobody, neither the civilian government nor the army, wanted to take responsibility for this relationship. The same goes, unfortunately, for Afghan policy. Everybody's passing the buck to everyone else as to, what our Afghan policy is. The same goes for economic reform, the energy crisis in the country, the joblessness. So there's just this failure to take responsibility and ownership of governors. We have now a surge in minority killings: Christians, Hindus, Sikhs, and those within minorities within the Islamic fold, Shias, Ahmadis, Agha Khanis. They are being killed on the streets. Nobody catches anyone. Nobody claims to protect these people. These people have nowhere to go for protection. This is a chronic situation. I mean, now again, I wouldn't call it a failed state because there are institutions that can protect these people. There's a police force, there's an army, there's a bureaucracy, there's a civil service, which are all functioning. But if nobody deems it worthy that these people should be protected, that is the hallmark of a failing state, if not a failed state.
So you think it's a failing state? This is the title of your book, Pakistan on the Brink. Now, some could say that Pakistan is always on the brink. And you'll remember when it was overwhelmed by these devastating floods, which seemed to literally, they tore the country apart along the Indus. And people wondered then whether that would be the killer blow. And yet everyone seemed to end up concluding it would just muddle along, as Pakistan did. It just shifted its parameters and the leadership shifted, and it just made do. What is different about right now as we speak that you think it's hovering perilously on the brink?
Well, I don't think we can muddle through this time, simply because we are facing for the first time a serious risk of abandonment by the international community at many different levels.
But they don't seem to mind that. I mean, they seem to say, great, let the Americans leave us alone. We don't want their aid, and we'll get along militarily.
But we don't have an economy that can sustain 180 million people and an army of 700,000 men and 100 nuclear weapons. That's the problem. And if that reality has not sunk in to our ruling elite, then we're probably even worse off than I thought. So I really feel at the moment that we have to wake up to the reality of where we are. Now, I've never been a proponent of this muddle-through theory, because the muddle-through theory, which has been advocated again by a lot of writers, is about a theory where you muddle through but nothing ever improves and nothing ever changes. What we need now is change and reform. Muddle through is not sufficient. We may be hanging on there by a thread, and we won't go under because of the institutions of the state are very powerful. But muddle through is really not an option, and we need change. I don't think that if we face abandonment by the West, if the economic crisis worsens in the country, if there is no settlement in Afghanistan and the civil war there continues and the Taliban expand even more in Pakistan to what they are today, then nobody can be talking about muddling through. We're talking about a seriously worse situation than exists today. If, as is happening, Christians are leaving the country in droves, and this country was founded on Jinnah talking about go to your churches and pray freely, you're living in a free country. If this is a country that cannot protect its minorities, and its minorities are voting with their feet and leaving, then we are not muddling through.
But if someone from the Pakistan military was sitting in this chair, he might say, Mr. Rashid, we are threatened by India. We are threatened by the United States with the double dealing. And there's Afghanistan about to fall apart. And look, we have lost tens of thousands of Pakistani troops. We have been on the front line, Mr. Rashid. What would you say?
Well, if you were a military person, I don't know if I'd be sitting here. I mean, to tell you the truth. But I'm sure that there's military people in the audience, as there have been at every one of my talks in London this week. Anyway, I just hope the cables that they're sending back to GHQ, are fair.
Yes.
And
your love for your country is undeniable.
Yeah. So look, as far as India is concerned, I mean, I think, this bogey really has to be put to rest. I don't believe that a country now with 9% growth rate or 8% growth rate can afford to go to war. You get countries which are too rich to go to war or are trying to grow to go to war. A country with a 2% growth rate, which is the case for Pakistan, can go to war because they really have very little to lose. So, I don't think anyone in India would like to see another war with Pakistan, which would end in another stalemate and a huge loss of prestige and investment and economy and all the rest of it. I think, the present bonhomie between the two people, the trade links that are being formed, I hope that they can be sustained. But there's one very dire warning here, which the whole world is aware of, and that is that good relations with India are held hostage now, not by Indian obstinacy, although that is still an issue, but they're held hostage by the extremists. Any group of extremists, Hafiz Saeed, who's just been given a 10 million bounty by the US, can send his people into and do another Mumbai, which will completely destroy the whole progress that has been made. So why are we, a state of 180 million people, allowing ourselves to be held hostage by a bunch of extremists? It doesn't make logical sense.
Is that because you write in your book that they're the weapon of foreign policy? Well,
it has been, but right now, I mean, now, and I will go further than that. And I would say, given the sort of, the economic and political mess in Pakistan, you are not going to get investment from, frankly, anywhere. The Americans are not going to come and put up factories in Pakistan, nor the Europeans, nor anyone else. Perhaps the only people who might decide to invest in Pakistan because of its geostrategic location and servicing to Central Asia and Afghanistan are the Indians. Now, so we should be encouraging not just investment from India, but from the region. We occupy this enormous geostrategic space, which bridges, Central Asia with the Gulf, Iran with South Asia, the Gulf with India. We are a natural hub of transportation, pipelines, electricity lines, factories that supply goods to all these regions. And we've failed to take advantage of this. I mean, the biggest white elephant in the country was Gwadar. We built this port on the Balochistan coast opposite Iran, which was supposed to deal with this huge volume of trade that was supposed to come down from Central Asia after the breakup of the Soviet Union. But not a truck came down, not a train came down. And everybody's saying, what's happened to Gwadar? I mean, why? Well, obviously, if the military at that time was supporting the Taliban, the war in Afghanistan, who was going to come through Afghanistan to deliver goods to Gwadar? Right now, we have a war in Balochistan. Who is going to come to Gwadar to deliver goods to Gwadar with a double war, one in Afghanistan and one in Balochistan? So, that is the lack of strategic thinking that is going on, frankly, in Pakistan, by the military, not by anyone else. I mean, the civilians don't get a leg in to say as to what's going on. And Gwadar was not sanctioned by the civilians. It was not built by the civilians. So I think, this is the real problem, that strategic thinking, certainly since the end of the Cold War, has just been totally lacking.
And obviously you've given us a fairly bleak assessment of the consequences for Pakistan. What about Afghanistan? In your book, you quote a former ambassador who says, mending Afghanistan is not possible while Pakistan continues to fall apart. Now, Hamid Karzai, Afghan president, calls India our neighbor and Pakistan our twin brother. And on one occasion, he said twin brother with knives. But so how do, probably was badly translated. Move us to Afghanistan, because we are at this critical period, and Pakistan is part of how the future will unfold in Afghanistan. Start maybe with the first one that may be on people's minds here. Talks with the Taliban. Many of the Taliban leaders are based in Pakistan.
Well, the majority of the Taliban leadership is based in Pakistan, and the problem, as many of you know, and many of you have been quite critical of it, that I have, for the last couple of years, certainly gone out of my way to support the idea of talks with the Taliban. Now, I just have a very simple thesis. First of all, if the Americans leave Afghanistan in the present state of civil war, in other words, without a peaceful end to this war, The government in Kabul cannot last over an extended period of time. It cannot last. Secondly, there would be a multi-sided, multi-dimensional civil war in the country, which could involve the Taliban, the government, the new ANA, the warlords, the various other northern ethnic groups, etc. We know, for example, the other ethnic groups are arming. Finally, the Americans agreed to talks with the Taliban. Now, remember, the Taliban asked for these talks. Now, I sincerely believe...
With the Americans. With the Americans.
With the Americans. The Taliban do not either... they don't want a civil war to follow the American withdrawal either. They're exhausted, they're tired, they want to go back to Afghanistan, they're fed up with living in Pakistan, they're fed up with the micromanagement of the ISI. They are... consider themselves as Afghan first. They don't want to be called stooges of Pakistan. They are determined to go back. And they also understand that they cannot rule Afghanistan again. They also understand that if they go back and even try and capture Kabul or rule Afghanistan, the West would walk away, the money would walk away, and in 6 months the entire Afghan population would be against them. So they decided that, talks are a good thing. So they want to talk to the occupier of Afghanistan, which is the Americans. Now, unfortunately, what has happened in this process is that it was a very logical thing. What should have happened, there should have been some trust-building measures between the two sides. That should have led to some military trust-building measures between the two sides. The American military saying, okay, we won't do so-and-so for a couple of months in this province or in this region. The Taliban saying, we won't do so-and-so. Followed by a reduction in the violence in the country, followed by talks between the government and the Taliban on some kind of political agreement, arrangement, some power-sharing arrangement. But at the moment, that is all stymied. It's all, the process is suspended, and quite frankly, the process is suspended largely because of the Americans, not because of the Taliban. The Americans are deeply divided on talks. There is between the Defense Department and the State Department and the White House, there are very serious divisions. And quite frankly, the US military really does not believe that talks can succeed now or even should be followed. It doesn't posit you an alternative strategy. What's the alternative to, if you don't talk? You're going to keep fighting to the last day of 2014? I mean, what are you going to do? So, and quite frankly, I've been very critical of the Americans that, the President, the Secretary of State have not put their foot down and brought this division, brought this division to an end. And essentially followed through on one consistent policy and pushed it through. Now we are in this election stage. That means we are going to be held hostage to these elections. They are not going to be able to really take any serious decisions.
American or Afghan?
The Americans. Until after November. If Obama wins, then, But, negotiations with the Afghans. Many of you have been there. This is not something you can order up like a pot of tea. And we'll have negotiations day after tomorrow, and they'll end on the 4th day. These negotiations can take months and years. That is the Afghan way, and that is how they have historically, traditionally conducted. They cannot be conducted on a timetable given by the Americans.
But so you talk about the divisions in the American camp, but then you talk about the Taliban as they, as if this was a united Taliban front. And I think all of us here followed with great concern the attacks in Kabul, which have been linked to the Haqqani network, which, of course, is an ally of the Taliban, or not Taliban per se. And there are reports that the younger commanders are not loyal to Mullah Omar, the Taliban leader. There's divisions within Taliban ranks. So when you say the Taliban want to talk, do all of the Taliban want to talk, or is this going to be infighting amongst them too?
Well, look, I mean, certainly I remain impressed overall that the Taliban are a hierarchical group. They still believe in their leaders. They have not, even those Taliban who are now living in semi-retirement in Kabul or Dubai or wherever, they have not broken with their leadership. They have not denounced their past or denounced their affiliation to the Taliban. They continue to defend the Taliban. So really what we're looking at is a group that still remains fairly coherent. And I think loyalty to Mullah Omar is still very much there. And I would really say that right now, Mullah Omar's blessing for a peace agreement would be needed to bring in all the Taliban. It will be very difficult for any peace agreement to be passed without Mullah Omar's blessing, and it will be very difficult for any Taliban to reject Mullah Omar's blessing. So, now this is something that goes in favor of the talks process. If you want to do, as some American commanders do, to fragment the Taliban, make them into myriads of groups, destroy the leadership, etc., then you're asking for trouble, because, then you have to negotiate with 100 different groups, not one or two or three. Now, certainly within this, there will be hardliners. There will be those commanders on the ground. In fact, we're already getting reports that some commanders on the ground are very upset with these negotiations in Qatar. And this could have possibly led to this attack on Kabul the other day. So there are commanders, certainly, who've been influenced by Al-Qaeda, who other reasons, etc., feel that they're on the cusp of victory and don't want to talk. But I think, overall, if there is progress, and this is the big if there is progress in the talks, I think, you will see the Taliban come around. Generally, broadly speaking, most Taliban. But, the Taliban, the hardliners, have to also to be shown that the Americans are actually conceding things also, and that there is progress in these negotiations, and there is a reduction in the violence.
But in your book, and you've said this in your articles, that if there is not some kind of a political deal with the Taliban before the foreign forces leave, that there will be the prospect of continuing violence, if not civil war. And yet you're very scathing that in more than a decade, NATO has failed to achieve any of its goals. And I'll quote you here, rebuilding an Afghan state, defeating the Taliban, and stabilizing the region. And there's less than 2 years to actually achieve any of that. So the clock is ticking. Is it really possible?
Well, look, I mean, we all know there have been huge mistakes made by the West, by the Americans. I mean, the economy, the investments, the corruption was being partly fueled by, the overspending by the Americans. I mean, we can go into this whole litany. Yes, I mean, time is very short. There's been an overdevelopment and overinvestment in the Afghan military, insufficient investment in civil service, bureaucracy, the other parts of the state infrastructure which should have been developed alongside the military. And all this is a fault of both the Bush and Obama administrations having total aversion to this phrase nation building, which has become a kind of dirty word in the lexicon of politicians. But in fact, what have you been doing in Afghanistan? You've been trying to do nation building. Lopsided, not entirely correct, wrong perhaps in many, but essentially that's what you've been doing. So look, I think the biggest failure in Afghanistan has been the failure to establish an indigenous economy. And 10 years, all this money, investment, and we still don't have an Afghan economy which is even remotely close to what the communists overthrew in '78, which I saw myself. Where at least, there was self-sufficiency more or less in food. There was some exports. Food was exported to some extent, fruit and vegetables and things. And there was a small base of cottage industries and things where, we don't even really have that. I mean, factories have been set up to produce uniforms for the ANA and for the American forces. Well, what happens when all these forces disappear? I mean, what will these factories produce? So my real and all these tens of thousands of Afghans who've been servicing the foreign troops as drivers and cooks and interpreters and translators and bodyguards and everything else, what happens to them? I mean, they're going to be massively out of job. So I hope that we will see. I mean, for the economy, there's time. I mean, there's minerals, there's oil, there's a lot of potential in Afghanistan. Afghanistan as a trading hub also has great potential. But all this needs peace and security. And all this needs an end to the war.
And you write in your book about how your own disappointment in President Obama, of course he's not your president, but you went to this dinner in that period between his being elected and being sworn in January 2009. You thought quite a bit of him, and yet, although we describe it as Obama's war, it's quite interesting how you say that Obama only describes this war in geopolitical terms. And for all the faults of George W. Bush, he and his wife Laura personalized the war, talked about Afghans, met Afghans. I mean, tell us about what you've come to believe about Obama's war.
Well, I mean, the man is an incredibly personable man. I mean, and a very charismatic figure and all the rest of it. And you expect this to be displayed in foreign policy. And, I don't know about the rest of, what happens in the Arab world and all that. But certainly, in Afghanistan and Pakistan, for 4 years, there was this real attempt to kind of distance the personality of the president out of, to have nothing to do with these countries, to make these necessary speeches about surges and troops and coming and going and all the rest of it, but not to have any personal relationship with Afghans or with Pakistanis, or even to use personal relationships with people to show that I'm committed to Afghanistan, I'm committed to, helping Pakistan, etc. I mean, Richard Holbrooke was a prime example of this. I mean, he went out of his way to make relations with people in government, with Pakistani journalists, with Tom, Dick, and Harry. I mean, same with Afghans. Now, some of the things he did went down the wrong way, etc., and he never got on with Obama. But he really made an effort. But there wasn't. This. I mean, I cannot recall in 4 years that Obama has invited Afghans to the White House. I cannot recall. Maybe I'm totally wrong, so you can't quote me on this because I don't have a record of all his meetings. But there's really, I mean, and you remember the Bushes. I mean, not that, my position on the Bushes. I mean, Laura Bush did education. Now, all that Mrs. Obama has done for the people in America, she could have picked up a subject for Afghanistan where 150,000 troops were fighting, where American forces were dying every day. She could have picked up anything, women's rights.
Military families.
Sorry?
She does military families.
Well, military families,
not
okay.
Afghans, though.
But I was just extremely disappointed in this, that there was just no personal touch in this whole effort. And there was just the opposite. I mean, I was asked the other day that when was the last time Hillary Clinton made a statement on Afghanistan? Policy statement. And I think it was in April 2011, which was exactly a year ago today. So what are we supposed to do? I mean, what are the Afghans supposed to think? If, the Secretary of State is not able to make a policy statement for a whole year, on a subject in which 100,000 American troops are involved.
But I'm sure President Obama liked you when he met you as Pakistani writer. I'm sure he didn't draw any conclusions. Let me just ask one last question before I open up the conversation. Let's talk about the other president that you know well. And you use a very interesting quote when you talk about Hamid Karzai's governing style, because he quotes, some of you here may know Ron Newman, who came as an ambassador to Kabul. Well, as you would know, his father was also an ambassador to Kabul during Zahir Shah's time. And he is quoted in the cable as saying that even during Zahir Shah's time, the king had an excessively cautious governing style in the 70s, and that it was all about survival. And you say that to this day, that is the kind of style, of course, with differences, that Hamid Karzai is manifesting as he tries to keep this impossible situation together in some way.
Yes, I mean, you see the poor man's history of presidents, Afghan presidents. I mean, since the 19th century, how many of them have not been killed? It's not the issue of how many have been killed, how many have not been killed, and very few have not been killed in office. So certainly all the communist presidents were eventually killed in office or out of office, and before that too. So, look, I mean, certainly compare, I know Karzai since the early 80s, and I've had a very long relationship with him. And I certainly thought in 2001, given the choices that there were, with everyone having so much blood on their hands, he was probably the best possible choice. Since then, as in this book, as in my earlier book also, I've become extremely critical of him. I think he had many decisions to make, many choices to make, and he invariably chose the wrong one. And that has been really tragic for him, for Afghanistan, for the region, etc. And we can talk about Karzai and his, his mental state and all the rest of it. But I think the critical, failure has been he failed to build up a team. If you look at the people who passed through the presidency, you've had the best and brightest Afghans, foreign educated, technocrats, local people, power wielders, who've gone through the presidency as his chief of staff, his press spokesman, his advisors in the president. I'm not talking about the cabinet now. I'm talking about his people who see him 3 or 4 times a day. And he has dispensed with anybody who came up and who was really credible. He's dispensed with, and sent them into the boonies. Number one. And number two, so you never build up a team. And number two, rather than build up a team which is, like-minded, thinking forward, has some vision of the future, etc., you bring together a coterie of people who have massively conflicting opinions. And that's what he's done at present. I mean, you have people from the extreme right to, former communists almost inside the presidency. And they are killing each other every day. And they're giving Karzai completely contradictory advice every single day. So every day you'll have a statement from Karzai. Today I woke up and I thought of this. Well, today somebody put something in his ear and he sprouted it out. So this is the problem. I mean, and in 10 years, rather than effectively put together a team, governance, and pursue these issues, you end up with a team that is giving you totally contradictory advice over the talks with the Taliban, over Pakistan, over the Americans, relations with the Americans, etc., etc. So I don't think you can function like this.
Well, I'm sure there's a lot of questions in the audience, and let me break with, let us say, protocol here, and lest you think that Ahmed Rashid only talks to presidents, I'm going to mention 2 other men in his life who are here tonight, because after you get to that great quote I mentioned, which is at the start of the book, you're also going to see the dedication. And sitting right here in the front row is Ralph Luminow, who was Ahmed Rashid's teacher, who he's still at Malvern College, and they still remain in touch to this day. And he exercised a very important influence on him. We want to say welcome to the Frontline Club. We hope you'll continue to come here. And way at the back, almost in a diagonal, is the other man in his life, is Raphael, who's Ahmed's son, Rafa. Now, don't turn around and look at him. But he's here too. So welcome to both of you. Since this is a gathering of friends, I thought we would at least introduce these people. If you could raise your hand, and if you'd like to say who you are, and yes.
Thank you, Lyse. Ahmed, I'm Amy Kellogg with Fox News.
Yeah.
And I have 3 questions, so I know that's cheeky and greedy. Choose
Let's try
one.
2, and then we'll get down to 1.
Okay, you choose one of them. I have 3 questions that come to mind. Whatever happened to Pervez Musharraf? I know there was a lot of talk that he was going back to Pakistan in January, and then that all went quiet. 2, what happened to Bin Laden's wives? And 3, the role of Iran in Afghanistan, how you see that. So choose one of the questions. Those are the 3 that came to my mind. I find them all quite interesting.
Bin Laden's wives are being deported to Saudi Arabia very soon, I think, today or tomorrow or something like that. Musharraf is hanging around between Dubai and London and New York and giving talks and lectures, and he's certainly not going back because most of his support base, whatever small support base he had, has completely dissipated and joined up with Imran Khan. So that's not happening. And what is the third thing you asked?
Iran.
Well, Iran is a very important neighbor of Afghanistan, and Karzai, I mean, I think he's handled Iran extremely well, given the antipathy from Bush, from Obama, and the crisis that the Americans have had with Iran and the bitterness that the Americans have for Iran, Karzai has to deal with Iran. He's an ally of America, but he has to deal with Iran as a friend and neighbor. And I think he's done pretty well. Iran has helped enormously in Western Afghanistan, providing electricity and water and road building and other things. It is doing other things also. It is supporting elements of the Taliban. It is certainly building up a support base within the Shias in Afghanistan if Iran is attacked by the Americans or by Israel. That danger is there, but I think Iran is doing that in many, many countries in the Middle East and in Pakistan and India and everywhere else. But I don't think Iran, clearly if there's a war with Iran and Israel, then the Karzai is going to be put into a terribly difficult situation. And there will be a lot of protests, anti-American riots in Afghanistan, as we've seen in the recent past.
I'm Ajay Mariwala at the British Red Cross, although that's kind of irrelevant to the question.
Very relevant.
I have two questions. One is that I guess I would ask you to sort of reconsider the muddle through thesis. I mean, it's clear in some ways that Pakistan itself has not muddled through, but I mean, do you think that the Pakistani elite and the ruling elite themselves and their own interests, which are quite distinct from the interests of Pakistan as a whole, have muddled through this situation? I mean, they've been able, on the one hand, to maintain their links with the Taliban while maintaining significant amounts of American aid. They've been able to maintain their kind of hold on contracting that comes from American aid. And despite the sort of sorry state of the economy, I mean, is that absolute layer of Pakistan really affected by this kind of economic crisis? And are they in some ways insulated from what happens to the Pakistani population as a whole? And the second thing that I wanted to ask is I understand that you argue that Pakistan itself is on the brink, but what happens after the Americans go from Afghanistan? Does Islamabad turn back into the kind of sleepy town that it was in the 90s? And does the Mujahideen that have benefited from Pakistan's clientism become redeployed in Kashmir, redeployed against Shias within Pakistan? I mean, do their interests change?
Okay. Well, look, as far as the elite is concerned, I think, what I said earlier, that time has passed for muddling through, even for the elite. I mean, large chunks of the elite will up and leave the country because they've got the money to do so. But obviously others can't. But I really think that we will face very serious challenges in the next year or so because of the crisis in the country, and the elite will not be able to cope unless it's prepared to change. One crisis could be a very serious fundamentalist movement in the country, and already by unleashing these extremist parties as a result of this breakdown of relations with America, the military has opened a Pandora's box, in my opinion. And, Lashkar-e-Taiba and all these groups are out on the streets. Putting them back in the box now, nobody has the power to do this. 10 years ago, the military dictator would have put them back in the box and told them to go home and sit at home and be quiet, while we improve our relations with the Americans. And now nobody can do that. Nobody can send Hafiz Saeed home now and say, go and sit back, get back into your box. So I think that's the crisis of the elite. The other hopeful sign, let me say, is the youth of Pakistan. I think there's an enormous politicization of youth in favor of change and reform, which is why you've got, for example, this support for Imran Khan. I think a lot of it could be misunderstood, and we don't know exactly where Imran stands on a lot of issues. But the very fact that the youth are fed up with the existing political parties, existing political structures, fed up with the army, I think a key indicator of why we have not had a coup yet, under any circumstances before in Pakistan's history, by now we would have had a coup. The army would have taken over. We haven't had a coup because half the population is against the army. And the army knows that. And the army does not want, the army knows that if it comes into power now, it will be a polarizing issue for the population. Now, that's the first time something like this has happened. Every coup in Pakistan has been welcomed by the majority of the population. A coup now would not be welcomed. So I think, there's a lot of change in the air, and there is hope. It's not all bad news. The problem is that, young people and those who want change and desire, 60% of Pakistan's population is under 25 years old. So there are a lot of young people out there who are jobless, who are badly educated, who get fed these false narratives, and etc. So, we need, I hope that these young people can be galvanized into something positive.
What's your question?
Yeah.
I have a follow-up on that. My name is Claudia Rizzi. I'm an independent journalist and producer of documentaries. You mentioned the military sort of using these groups as, extremist groups. I wonder are they being just used, or are we looking at a fundamental change within at least certain sectors of the military, or maybe the ISI, where some of these extremist ideas actually, reached and infiltrated these institutions to the extent where they share some of the ideals?
Does anyone have a question which is similar that they wanted to add a complementary side to it, or do you want to hold your question? If anyone has on a similar vein, so he'll answer this. Yeah.
Question about IMU.
It's a similar vein.
IMU, because it's one of
Okay.
those groups.
Do you want to ask that? Do you want to put them together then?
Well,
Yeah. What is it about your IMU?
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, my question was about what your project would be projection for the Central Asian countries post-Soviet regimes.
We'll just let's hold that then. It's not about IMU in Pakistan, okay, or in Afghanistan. Yes.
And I also
I'm going to start being I don't want to be a dictator in the Frontline Club, the home of democracy, but I'm going to have to limit it. Everyone here has more than a high school degree, so you must decide on one question. Okay.
Well, it was a follow-up to that. And,
Yes.
is there a real, because every time I hear about Pakistan or talk to people from Pakistan, I get a sense that there is kind of like an abandonment syndrome, whatever trauma you went through after 91 with the relationship with the United States, there's great fear of going through that again. Is there like a fundamental need to establish a real strategic relationship with the United States, or is there still a debate going on within the regime?
Okay.
look,
First, extremist
is
groups.
this working? Yeah.
Yeah.
What have I done? Look, even this abandonment theory that, the Americans dumped us and, repeatedly after wars with India, etc., etc. I mean, two things. First of all, the Americans armed us for the Cold War. They armed us to fight the Soviet Union. We armed ourselves through the Americans to fight India. So inherently, there was right from the 50s, there was this inherent contradiction between the aims of the two. And each war that was fought, these contradictions came to the fore. The Americans banned arms supplies, etc., etc. And we didn't give you these arms to fight India, right? So, that's the first issue. The second issue is that at every peak moment of abandonment, as it were, the loss of East Pakistan, biggest crisis the nation faced, the Arabs bailed us out. Okay, 1991. The Bush sanctions on Pakistan because of Pakistan's nuclear program, is essentially the Arabs bailed us out again. And there was vast payments made to Pakistan's nuclear program by the Arabs. What I'm trying to say now is that and the Chinese bailed us out, also helped us out. What I'm trying to say now is that why things are much more dangerous than before is that there's nobody to bail us out. The Arabs are fed up, essentially with us, because they have all suffered from Al-Qaeda, which most of it was based in Pakistan and people were coming and going, etc. They've crushed their Al-Qaeda, something that we haven't been able to do. They've crushed their Al-Qaeda. The Chinese, we've had 3 statements, tough statements by the Chinese, talking about the Uyghurs, the Chinese Muslims. I mean, Pakistanis have been shocked by these Chinese statements. The first time China has talked about Chinese Muslims training in Pakistan. And, and we've gone out of our way to try and find them and expel them and, all the rest of it. And then they go back to China and they're all executed. But the point I'm trying to make here is that, the bailouts now, we were lucky. We had allies who bailed us out, not just the Americans. But this crisis, nobody's there to bail you out. You know, Asif Zardari honestly spent the first 2 years of government with the economic crisis, knowing that it was coming, expecting a $5 billion bailout by the Americans. And sensible people went to him and said, "Are you stupid? You know, America's just crashed." We're talking about 2008, you know, and Goldman Sachs and all the... America's just crashed. Europe has crashed. You know, who's going to give you a bailout for 5 million while you keep the Taliban on your soil and while you keep all these militants on it? But there was this kind of, you know, mythology in the People's Party, which is actually, you know, probably one of the most sensible parties in the country otherwise, having this myth that we're going to get a bailout, you know. And nobody has given us a bailout in the last 4 years. And frankly, I mean, you know, nobody is going to give us a bailout in the next 4 years. We have to change ourselves.
And the extremist groups, how does it work? Is it they've penetrated into the military has actually penetrated?
Yeah, you know, it's a very complicated story, but I would say that the driving force at the moment in the military is anti-Americanism. And that has put Kiani and the high command in a very difficult situation. They want to have relations with America. The generals, especially the mid-level officers, don't. But, you know, the army knows also its bread and butter is, you know, is mostly comes from America. Its sophisticated weapons, etc., come from America. For the last 10 years, it's been able to resist. You know, it's received $20 billion in aid from 2 Bush administrations and the Obama administration up till now. 80% of that has gone to the military. So, you know, yes, and links with the extremists. Of course, they've been very long-standing, and there's a lot of talk about the possibility of a colonel's coup for the first time, and a coup within the army rather than a coup by the chief, a coup by junior officers. There's been a lot of talk about that. You know,
credible talk or just gupshup?
Huh? Well, nobody really knows what the situation is, how bad it is, and certainly we can presume, and these assassination attempts against Musharraf and Benazir, you know, demonstrate that there are very low-level army officers and soldiers and Air Force and Navy who are in touch with the extremists and who have helped some of these plots. You know, we know the attack on the Mehran Air Base in Karachi. That was an inside job. Many of these mass killings of soldiers and police have been inside jobs.
Okay. Yes, the gentleman, you still have the microphone? Or okay, well, let's get this one and then we'll come back to you with the IMU.
Thanks. My name's Lynn O'Donnell. I'm a journalist and a writer. There has been, you've talked a lot about the economic problems. The Arabs won't get involved. There's no bailout coming. The Americans and the Europeans are no longer interested in putting money in. Does this create an economic vacuum that the Chinese can fill? You haven't really mentioned the Chinese except in the context of the Uyghurs being sent back and them being the Chinese complaint recently, which was quite out of the blue and rather out of character for China, I thought. But what's your view on what role China could play, being an opportunistic neighbour and regional power?
Do you want to just pass the microphone here, just very quickly? We'll take 2 questions at the time from the fellow traveller.
And Ahmed, if I could ask about
identify for you.
Who's that?
Yes,
it's Nick from Nick Schifrin from ABC News.
Hi, Nick.
If I could go back to muddling, but ask it about solutions. Do you believe that Pakistan needs long-term solutions? And assuming you do, is there a risk in saying that muddling along isn't the right strategy, isn't the right notion, that Pakistan is on the brink? And the risk is that people in the U.S. will think, oh, people in the West will think, oh, it's always on the brink, there's always a crisis. Surely we can't invest anything long-term into Pakistan. We just have to find short-term solutions. So is there a risk in calling Pakistan on the brink for the Americans, for the Westerners, that they won't even think of long-term solutions? All they'll think of is, okay, we need to solve this crisis and not care about Pakistan tomorrow or next week or the next month.
Okay.
You know, China and Pakistan. Look, President Zardari was expecting a bailout from China. China doesn't give money. It doesn't give loans. It gives projects which it feels service its national security. So what has it done in Afghanistan in the last 10 years? Almost nothing, quite frankly. Less than $500 million have been spent in Afghanistan. in real, development. But it's taken up these huge contracts, iron ore, copper ore, all this kind of stuff, which will obviously benefit China. Same goes for Pakistan. I mean, it provides the military with technology and planes and aircraft and tanks and all that, but it doesn't give money, it doesn't give cash. And the top leadership of Pakistan has gone to China 50 times in the last 2 years, begging for money, basically, for a bailout. And that hasn't come. But on the other hand, China, as you know, does not sort of say it as it is. It's very careful, it's very discreet, it's, even with the North Koreans and with Iran and everything else. I think one thing that has started has been this dialogue that has started between the Americans and the Chinese to discuss Pakistan. It's the first time something like this has happened. And it's been going on for a few months now. That could prove very important. This is not a dialogue to undermine Pakistan or devastate, but a dialogue to how the Chinese and the Americans could work together to help Pakistan. So I think, that could be something. Look, I think, Nick, I mean, what the US and the international community as a whole, and given the anathema which people treat the US now, it's probably better that other people speak for this, Europeans, EU, ASEAN, whatever, rather than, is to encourage change and reform in Pakistan. Now, the international community promised a lot of aid to Pakistan, but it demanded, as the IMF, we broke with the IMF, precisely because we refused to carry out any reforms, economic reforms. So there has to be, I mean, if the Pakistani elite and the military, the civilians are not prepared to listen to, people in the media in Pakistan and politicians who want reforms, I think the international community should really push for reform and change jointly, together. And making a public argument. A lot of the process that we've seen in the last 4 years has all been behind the scenes. People going up to the president and prime, please, carry out this economic reform, that economic reform, but it's all been behind a curtain. I think the public of Pakistan needs to be educated how dire the situation is and how desperate the economic crisis is and how change and reform can improve. Only change and reform can improve it. Not more free money from World Bank, IMF, America, whatever.
So who's going to do that education? You're talking about new leaders?
Well, I think the international community has a role to play there, a major role. It should go public. It should, publicly tell the government that, look, I mean, if you want help, this is what we're offering, and we're going to say this in public, so that the people of Pakistan understand we're not withholding anything from them. We're willing to give them aid if they carry out reforms. Yeah.
My name is Ali Shilkamer from Open State Foundation. My question is about the post 2014 in terms of relationship between Central Asian regimes and Afghanistan. You say that there is likelihood that Taliban come back to Kabul, and what will be kind of attitudes of Taliban, the policy toward Central Asian countries, and what be role assigned to such groups as IMU? Would be used as kind of leverage against those countries and regimes, or as they would rather prefer to restrain them, kind of to tame?
The IMU.
Yes, the IMU. What it
means? Not only IMU, in general, kind of the Taliban policy toward.
Look, the Taliban have made Taliban have made several statements that they will not allow foreign terrorist groups to operate in Afghanistan. That they will not allow, Al Qaeda, whoever, to operate in Afghanistan. Now, clearly, this is not something that has been implemented yet. We know that the IMU is operating with the Taliban in northern Afghanistan. But clearly, if there is a peace settlement, I mean, I believe that the Taliban, as I said, want to be Afghans again. They don't want to be this international pariah and be castigated by the world for support. I mean, they made one mistake with Osama Bin Laden, and you know what that cost them. So, I think they have learned from some of the past. Now, maybe I'm being overly optimistic here, and of course there are many Taliban who will continue helping Al-Qaeda and continue helping the IMU, but I believe that the leadership is committed to the leadership does not want another civil war erupting after 2014.
And then to Robert in the front. Yeah, okay.
Hi, I'm Mary Rose Feiston. I'm a freelance journalist. I'm just interested in the experience for journalists on the ground in Pakistan and how it's changed perhaps over the last 5 years. Has it become harder to operate independently there? And how has that manifested in the last couple of years?
Very bad. What else do you want me to say? Life is not easy being a journalist in Pakistan. I fled the country twice last year because of threats. We don't know. 8 journalists were killed last year, 7 the year before. It's the highest death rate in the world. Not to speak of harassment and intimidation and all the rest of it. It's a very serious situation.
But there's greater freedoms. There's been mushrooming of Pakistani press.
Yeah, but a lot of the press is also, the press is also, like society, becoming very polarized. We have a very virulent, extremist right-wing press, which is either providing, succor for the extremists of some kind or the other, or the military and the intelligence services. We also have a liberal press, which is perhaps not so powerful as it used to be, given the threats that the other side carry, because they have guns and the liberals don't.
Robert Fox. Ahmed, your points about overt and covert activity by foreign powers in Afghanistan and Pakistan, can I raise particularly Afghanistan? Going on from what you were saying about who's making the policy in Washington and the power of the military and the way that the military, US military, is dominant in all international efforts, particularly in ISAF. Are you concerned that in fact they will break the 2014 barrier and will continue with covert operations in the way that McChrystal and Petraeus carried out a covert war with special forces, night raids and so on, enormous efforts by special forces? I'd just like to add that my contacts inside the country say that the CIA special forces are very soon going to outnumber the British and American special forces and European ones combined.
Look, as you know, the Americans want to keep 10, 20,000 troops beyond 2014, okay? And most of them are going to be special forces and drones and helicopters and CIA and all that. Now, look what happened in Iraq. At the end of the day, the Iraqis told the Americans to push off. And the Americans' idea was to leave 20,000 troops in Iraq, and they were told to leave. Now, there's so many inherent contradictions, frankly, in the American position right now. If you want to maintain bases in Afghanistan beyond 2014, every single neighboring country is against it. Right? Now, what does Karzai do? Does he sacrifice peace with his neighbors? Or does he satisfy the Americans? Or does he dump the Americans and create some kind of working relationship with the neighbors? They're very stark choices, in my opinion. And we are not really, I don't think governments are really fully, I don't think the US military is fully addressing this. There is a wave of anti-Americanism in the Afghan army, in the Afghan police, in the state structure, not to speak of the population. I'm not even talking about the Taliban. I'm talking about the population. How are you going to sustain military action by CIA, special forces, blah, 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 in a country which is becoming more and more hostile to you? It doesn't make sense to me, So what I'm trying to say is that before now, what is the American attitude right now? It is, we will fight to the last. We will fight until, I don't believe that, the American military is able to get an extension because the American public is against the war, Congress is against the war, nobody wants to spend the money, the Europeans are pulling out, NATO will fall apart, etc., etc. You know all those arguments. The Australians just announced yesterday that they're pulling out early, the French are already pulling out early. I I don't think there can be an extension of an American presence beyond 2014, because certainly Obama does not want that to happen. But even this whole conundrum of basing special forces there, having this so-called strategic pact, now what happens, when the special forces go around killing Afghans in night raids and things after 2014? What happens? I mean, there'll be uprisings against the Americans. So I think it's these issues have really not been tackled in a political way with a political strategy. You cannot just look at this in a sort of militarized kind of way. Well, we need guys, we need tough guys there to go and knock out, Al-Qaeda. Well, think of other things that you can park a ship in the ocean. You can keep guys there. You can keep missiles there. If you ever have to go back into Afghanistan in some form or shape to assassinate someone or kill Al-Qaeda or Ayman al-Zawahiri or whatever it is. So I don't think Karzai himself has thought through the consequences of this strategic compact. I think you will find a lot of regional opposition to this. As I said, I don't know any country except India which is in favor of, having a prolonged U.S. presence in northern Afghanistan.
But if they do get the strategic partnership, and it seems that Karzai, the lawyer Jurgen Kabul came up and said they wanted some forces to stay, the Americans do, special forces could slip in that way too.
Yeah, but look, I mean, we're still 18 months away. What happens if there's a strategic compact is signed? Well and good. And then the day after that, all the regional countries start messing around and saying, we're not accepting this, and making life very difficult for the U.S. presence. So there are all sorts of questions as to all these issues that I've raised. I mean that Karzai will have to find answers to. The Americans will have to find answers to.
Gentleman here.
Muhammad Bari, Muslim Council of Britain. You have given a very bleak picture about Pakistan, the abandonment by the international community, extremist army. Is there any realistic future for Pakistan? If you are put as a president, say, with all the powers, what would you do tomorrow?
Resign. By the way, just to get a sort of a sense of the room, I would like to kind of get a sense of how many people here believe also share this view that Pakistan is on the brink? Just a show of hands. And how many of you think it's going to muddle through? It could be both. Okay.
That's quite a lot.
Just want to get a sense of, okay, the rest think it's okay. There's hope. Okay, what would you do if you, and you're talking about Pakistan or Afghanistan? What would, if you were the president of Pakistan, if the Pakistani people elected you, Ahmed, what would be the first thing you would do?
Look, countries have foreign policies which reflect their domestic needs and desires, trade, good neighborliness, friendship, links, etc. And foreign policy is a result of domestic policy. We have exactly the opposite. We have a domestic policy emerges out of foreign policy or is a result of foreign policy. And foreign policy has utterly destroyed, our foreign policy has utterly destroyed our domestic ability to prosper and grow. Because we insist on housing extremists, we want to fight wars with our neighbors, who wants to invest in this environment, etc., etc. Now, I mean, the first thing is that we have to change this around. And the only way to change this around is to sit with the military and try and explain to the military that, look, this foreign policy is destroying the country. It's undermining the country. And we need to change this round where internalization of Pakistan's problems is the most important thing. We have to look at how we can carry out internal reforms and improve, things internally. Stop blaming the outsiders for everything and concentrate on looking at our own mistakes and our own internal problems. I think that would be the most significant thing that a civilian political leadership could do in its dialogue with the military. I think this pandering, the civilians come in, they act very tough in the beginning, and then the military slaps them down once, slaps them down twice, and then everybody goes into their little shell, and everybody stays quiet for the next 4 years. that is not a policy or a strategy. The civilians need a dialogue with the military, and a genuine dialogue. And elected leaders need to be able to discuss these issues with the military. Rather than trying to trump them here, put ISI under the Interior Ministry, try and change this guy here. You need a real strategic dialogue. And the biggest asset for the civil leaders is public opinion. Because I think public opinion is ready for such a dialogue. And yet the civilian leaders don't want to publicize it. They don't want to make it public.
Actually, it just brings me up to the question I wanted to ask you. My name is Saira Vahidi. I'm a retired journalist.
Journalists never retire.
Retired hurt in that case.
That's a good one, yeah, I must say.
Just a few months ago, in an interview with the Huffington Post, Jason Burke, talking about the Arab Spring, said that Western journalists often look at Muslim societies, and he included Pakistan in this, in terms of either extremists or they either have the opinion of extremists or they talk to educated, progressive people. And in fact, there are these two extremes of view that they get. And in fact, the majority of Muslim opinion, or the major part of Muslim opinion, is deeply socially conservative, religiously conservative, deeply anti-American, but most importantly, deeply anti-Western values. And you talk about bringing people into confidence, the people into confidence, and to aid reform. I mean, I don't know how you would respond to somebody like Jason Burke's comments about Muslim society.
I think he wants us to stop talking to you, Ahmed.
Look, let me just say that, for example, I talked about the youth, really not wanting anything to do with past political parties and all that, I think there's a desperate need for a new narrative in Pakistan. And unfortunately, the right dominates the narrative, which is, America's to blame for everything. India is next to blame for everything. Israel is third to blame for everything. And there's no narrative that is looking internally at our own problems. And I think voices that are raised in the country to look at our real problems. I mean, I hope, for example, the youth of Pakistan will read this and will try and understand that a new narrative is needed, and that only the youth can bring about that new narrative, because frankly the older generation is far too jaded and all the rest of it. So I think this argument that they're extremists and then they're liberals and they're clashing, I mean, this is it's true to some extent, but it's also a very simplistic argument.
What about the broad middle? The broad middle doesn't engage with Western journalists.
For example, I don't think the broad middle is against women's rights, or it wants to throw acid in women's faces, or it wants to kill Shias, or wants to kill Christians. I think the broad middle is but the broad middle have no voice as such. And the broad middle, unfortunately, in countries like Pakistan, because of the years of military rule, don't come out into the streets and demand a better society. It's only a few hundred people from the liberal elite who come into the streets. The broad middle, even though they may believe in those issues, never come out. But the other problem in Pakistan is that the worse things get, the more polarized we get, and the more extreme positions people start taking. And that, of course, is very dangerous for any society, especially when there's no real leadership in the country which can provide an honest vision.
James Thakra. For this conversation, I represented Index on Censorship with the release of Vanunu in Israel, represented him. So I'm quite interested in A.Q. Khan's relationship with Iran and a lot of things that have been going on under the table. I've been reading your articles for many, many years, and your understanding of Pakistan is unparalleled. Your comments about America. Why would you expect Obama to support and take responsibility for the most cataclysmic blunder that Bush made in history, which has been devolving ever since, and now we're at the end of that? You yourself said we'll probably get the Taliban. The Taliban is not a reformist organization. The ISI is full of allies of the Taliban. You have India on the back, and when this thing changes, you, with your understanding of it, can you be a prophet and say who is really running Pakistan? And if this situation devolves and we get the Taliban and they're not a reformist society, who will end up running Pakistan and how will they seize control?
Pakistan or Afghanistan?
Pakistan.
Well,
there's certainly a connection between what happens to the Taliban and what happens to
look,
Pakistan.
the argument I was making that really nobody is running Pakistan right now because nobody wants to take responsibility for critical decisions. Nobody wants to support, for example, a resumption of US aid. Nobody wants to cancel the possibility of US aid. So, you know, we are really in a situation where no one wants to own up to anything. You know, and this is the crisis that we've suffered for 6 months, you know, with the Americans and the whole delay in getting this relationship restarted again. If people were to own up to something and to own up to their responsibilities, like the government should or the military should, you know, we would not be in this mess. You know, where we come at the moment, because foreign policy exerts such a huge agenda for Pakistan. Relations with India, relations with Afghanistan, relations with United States, all this tops the domestic crisis, unfortunately. Unfortunately. I wish, you know, people could concentrate on the economic and domestic issues, but they don't. They concentrate on the international crisis that we face, the fear of international isolation, the fear of being, you know, trumped by India in Afghanistan, etc. And who is responsible for that? Well, mostly the military, because the military have run foreign policy for the last 50 years. And it's the military that has to change this foreign policy. And the civilians, all the civilians, as I said earlier, can do is to encourage the military to understand that the depth of this crisis cannot come about with trying to be clever here and bringing Hafiz Saeed out and putting him back and bringing him out again. And this kind of trickery and jack-in-the-box kind of thing is over. That you could do during the Cold War. The Americans didn't mind. And, you know, everybody stayed silent because you were a loyal ally of the Western world. But now nobody wants to stay silent.
So there's absolutely no hidden agenda incorporating a Taliban takeover in Afghanistan?
Well, Afghanistan is a different issue. You asked about Pakistan. Afghanistan, you know, is a different issue. You know, I believe that a process of negotiations with the Taliban, a prolonged process, maybe lasting a year or two, between the government, the Americans, the Taliban, exposing the Taliban office, if it's ever made in Qatar, to exposing the Taliban to modern Afghan society. All this will have an impact on moderating the Taliban's social position, social beliefs. And I think we have to try it. You know, I think we have to try it. The Taliban have already said, that they will not, most Taliban are now allowing girls' schools, for example, to exist. Now, you know, Taliban have never met any Afghan women, modern Afghan women. You know, they've been holed up in Pakistan, or they've been in the battlefield. You know, I would like an office to be set up and 10 Taliban to be there and Afghan women to be able to come and talk to the Taliban. Working Afghan women. Students, Afghan society, which has grown up. You know, don't forget, a lot of good has emerged in the last 10 years in Afghanistan. You've got 8 million kids in school, you've got health, you've got all sorts of good things that have happened. And the Taliban have no idea of these things, you know, because they've been living in the mountains. So I think exposing them to these Afghans who benefited from the last 10 years would be a great thing, which is why also these talks are so important. You're not going to get the Taliban to drop their extreme demands on social, you know, issues like Islam and Sharia. You're not going to get them to drop them by fiat, by telling them, you drop them. They're not going to drop them. You're going to drop them by introducing them to people who are like them, speak their language, but are different. And that's all I'm saying.
We're getting to that awkward time when we're rapidly running out of time, but gaining in questions. So there's this lady here, and then you can also pass it to Irfan. So we'll take those two in a row. The lady there, no, the one you're in front of. Yes, this one, you're the lady. Me? Yes. And then Irfan, who's here in the corner with his hand up. We'll have the next one. Then we'll have two more in the front. Oh, and the woman in the back. Okay, we'll take those three. Very short questions and short answers.
Yeah, my question is about what you would advise U.S. policymakers in, because it seems as if the U.S. is also muddling through as far as their strategic long-term policy towards Pakistan, that they are going around Pakistani leadership to achieve their goals there. And I'm wondering if there's any honest dialogue going on. You say that the Americans are very frustrated. So how do you see that long-term relationship playing out? And
okay, that's good. This muddle is never going to leave you, Ahmed. This gentleman here, you got a microphone now, and then the lady here, and then we'll come take this with your hand up, please. She wants to take the microphone. Oh, you have one. Okay.
I'm Irfan Hussain, a Pakistani journalist. Ahmed, you spoke about the possibility, indeed the probability, of the resumption of the civil war in Afghanistan after the Americans leave in 2014. Now, what do you think would be the fallout for Pakistan, especially after American interest in the region would be virtually zero and be very little aid to Pakistan coming in? How do you see this scenario unfolding?
Okay, and this lady, yeah. Hello?
Yeah, yes. Hi, Julian West. Ahmed.
Right.
Hi. Just following on from what you were saying earlier, it's just a follow-up question really, which is vis-a-vis the domestic foreign policy. I mean, surely one of the biggest problems in Pakistan has always been the fact that the military gain their sort of raison d'etre from having this basically a sort of ongoing feud with India. I mean, the very size of the army, the money they make, pretty much everything about them sort of derives from having this very aggressive relationship with India as their, sort of signal part of their foreign policy. I mean, I'm just interested to know how you could see that changing, if at all. And the other thing is the question of the fundamentalists in Pakistan. I mean, has it got so out of control that it just can't go back?
Thank you. Do you want to start with the muddle, the Americans' muddle? How would you advise the Americans?
Well, my first answer that the effect of a civil war in Afghanistan obviously would be devastating in Pakistan, because then all bets would be off. I think a peace process in Afghanistan would lead to enormous positive changes vis-a-vis the Pakistani Taliban and the state. The Pakistani Taliban would really be left bereft without a raison d'etre if there was a peaceful solution in Afghanistan. And obviously, on the contrary, if there is a multi-sided civil war in Afghanistan, then the Pakistani Taliban will only be able to expand their reach, across more of Pakistan, and the situation will become even more dangerous. So I'm fearful about that. On the army, well, you're absolutely right. This is a very critical issue, and it's a very difficult issue. Look at Egypt just now. I mean, the Egyptian military is refusing to give up power in any form or shape. It's not willing to give up political power, economic power, or anything else. And it even had the audacity to launch the intelligence chief as a presidential candidate, which has now been, stopped down or stepped down. Again, there is enormous suffering, economic suffering in Pakistan, and the army, has to understand it has to take a hit economically. Now, how will it take a hit? Will it accept that? I really worry that the crisis in Pakistan is eventually going to be that you won't be able to pay salaries of government servants and soldiers and teachers, and then what happens? If you look at the electricity crisis now, there's a $5 or $6 billion circular debt, which can never be paid. Well, nobody has the money to pay it. And Pakistan certainly doesn't. And we have up to 16, 18 hours of no electricity a day. Now, the military is suffering also because its factories are suffering, its cantonments are suffering, etc. Its families are suffering. So, the military is not devoid of realizing that, it needs to give up some of these perks and privileges and generate more economic livelihood, rather than just keep on in its old way.
What would be the advice to the Americans?
The advice to the Americans on Afghanistan is you have to talk to the Taliban. And you have to come to a settlement, and you can't leave this country in a state of civil war. The advice on Pakistan would be that you have to be patient. you can't abandon Pakistan. You can't start abusing Pakistan. Pakistan is far too important a country to be left, bereft or left alone. What you can do is to encourage change and reform by enlisting the global community, the international community, to which Pakistan is very closely linked and is very closely a part of, whether it's through trade or economic loans or university studies or whatever it is. I mean, we are not a pariah state. We are part of the world. And if the world can point out to the leadership and to the public that, you need to change, I think that, could make a difference.
Representative of the Army, is this vis-a-vis India, that's what forges its identity because it's in opposition to India, the rivalry? That's the question. Yeah.
Sorry?
India rivalry. What for the question from Julie that this is what forges the American-defined identity vis-a-vis India.
This new trade that is started between India and Pakistan, I hope it leads to something. But look, ultimately, as I said before, Pakistanis are held hostage. The good relations with India are held hostage by these extremists. They're not held hostage by the Pakistanis or by the Indians. And we have to deal with this extremism for our own sake, not because India is saying it, but for our own sake. I hope we realize that India is the only potential investor and potential economic benefactor in this region. India is going to become a superpower. So how long are we going to ignore a superpower sitting on our doorstep?
And just very quickly at the end of this, Mina and then Elizabeth. Yeah.
Mina Ehrenfeld, Open Study Foundations. You've been very eloquent about the absolute need for reform and the demand that must happen. There's no other way. But besides your own stint just now of a few minutes of being president, with all-powerful president, who are the reformers? Who should we be watching?
In Pakistan.
In Pakistan.
Oh, I think, there are NGOs, there's civil society, there are women, there are members of some of the political parties who are deeply aware of what I'm saying, but they can't necessarily articulate it because of the political line of their parties. I think there are people in the military also who are aware of this. A lot of young people, are aware of this. But, the question is, how do you focus, mobilize, galvanize, produce a leadership which is, modern-looking, forward-looking, reform-minded, etc. These are all huge problems.
Elizabeth?
Elizabeth Winter, specialist on Afghanistan. You've given your advice very generously. Your advice is sought worldwide. What you haven't talked about this evening is advice for the British, the military, development, and Foreign Office people. If you were to advise them on Afghanistan and Pakistan now, are they totally irrelevant, or are there things they should be doing?
No, look, I mean, I was at the House of Commons today, and I spoke to various people, and I said, look, you're one of the few countries in the world where you have complete unanimity, politically speaking, across the board of talking to the Taliban. Now, you have sat quietly while the Americans are all in dispute about this and they can't agree. Why haven't you used this, Labour, Conservative, Lib Dem unity on this issue to try and push the Americans to understand how critical the issue is? Now, maybe privately, the politicians have done this. David Cameron has done this. But, I think public pressure is needed. Public pressure is needed. You have lots of political capital with America. You don't spoil anything with America because you might point out that America should be doing certain policies in Afghanistan. And I think, really, I blame, Gordon Brown for pushing this under the covers, as it were, not having a public debate on Afghan policy first with Bush, then with Obama, and now we've got David Cameron doing exactly the same thing, not having a public debate. You would enjoy, you could talk to the, you're the only country in Europe which has unanimous support on this issue, basically, to talk to the Taliban and, obviously to pull out troops. Putting out troops, I won't say, I really don't know the mechanics of, the British Army, except that I know that it's been cut back hugely. But I think on this issue, there should be greater British public input into debating the Americans on the end game in Afghanistan. And there's huge, discussion in your press, on TV, etc. It's a real, I was telling an American friend today that, there's no debate in America about Afghanistan. I mean, I've had a really tough time trying to tell, to educate the Americans about Afghanistan. There's just no debate about the end game. Here, there is a huge debate about the end game, pro and anti, whatever. And you should, I think, generate some international pressure using that kind of debate that you have internally.
Well, that's perhaps a very good way to end, is bringing it back to all of us who live here in Britain. Now, Ahmed's favorite teacher withdrew his question, but I think we should ask you, how did your student do tonight, Ralph Blumenau? You're sitting there in the front row taking notes. I mean, how has he? He's done?
Alpha.
Alpha? No, alpha male or alpha? Yes. Ahmed, you've been very generous with your time and, as Elizabeth said, sharing your advice and your wisdom with us. I mean, it would be a terrible thing to say, but in some way we want you to be wrong. We don't want Pakistan or Afghanistan to be on the brink. But perhaps what we'll all say is we'll hold on to what you have still presented, is that there is still this hope, and it comes out in how many times you do write articles saying either there should be talks or leadership has to have a wake-up call. So we'll hold on to that it won't just be a muddling through, but it will actually be grabbing the situation and putting it on a different course. So thank you all very, very much. I'll promise you can have a few more minutes with Ahmed. You may even get more questions. And I have a sort of a heavy feeling that I might have forgotten someone here in this middle here, that Ahmed is going to be kindly signing books, which you, of course, living in a democracy, you can choose to buy or not to buy. But he'll be here for a short time to sign books. But please join me in thanking Ahmed for sharing time with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Louise. God bless you.
God bless you, Mr. President.